residence in Libya. We spent the last hour or so before Mincha carefully reading portions of the Midrash Eicha. As I flipped this morning, I realized over the years we've covered almost the entire Sichta, the introduction portion, which was quite meaty, and have worked our way fairly deeply into the flesh of the first chapter. However, we have gotten no further than the letter Beis in the first parak of Eicha, his life. And the Midrash is going to be discussing peculiar locution of the verse, V'chol ticheh b'layla. You shall weep in the night. And in the first section, we'll be dealing with this weeping. The Midrash moves from the mention of weeping in Tehillim to the verse of, in Eicha, to the verse in Tehillim which relates weeping to bread. In Perik Mem Beis. One of the nice things about the particular program from which I copied your sources is that you have the psukim on the bottom of the page. I did my best to play Rina and make sure all the Shemos Hashem were caught. She's much better at it than I, but I was on short time and I tried to bother her. In any case, the pasuk in Tehillim in the 42nd chapter, my tears were my bread day and night. And the question, and of course that pasuk ends, but the Moralai kol hayom ayeh elokem. When they said to me all the day, where is your God? Of course, one of the tricks that the Midrash uses, please welcome the ladies in. One of the tricks that the Midrash uses is using the second half of the verse almost like a surprise punchline, where the first half is discussed, and only later in the Midrashic interpretation do they spring the second half of the verse on us with a kind of drama. So in this verse we have a discussion, meditation by Rav Eicha B'Rabbanan. Why exactly are tears to be metaphorically related to bread? Rabbi Eicha Omer, please Harry, come and sit anywhere you're comfortable. Rabbi Eicha Omer, Rabbi Eicha said, Kishem shehalechem todir kach dim osi tadira. Somewhere under this is the distinction between continual and continuous, which I'm sure Mark can inform us of. The tadira means my tears come to me at regular intervals, right? That is continual, right? My tears, in other words, there is no time when I can be sure that I have finally finished with the weeping. My tears come to me and continually, just as bread, you don't eat every minute, but nevertheless, on a regular basis, the body requires nourishment. And so that is Rav Eicha's sense of the metaphor. Rabbonon Amrin, but the other sages said, Kol mi sheboche eno ochen. It is actually referring to a kind of replacement. It means that my tears have taken the place of my bread. It means my appetite has been supplanted by my grief. Lo aleinu v'lo aleichem, anyone who has ever known grief or terrible anxiety, one of the phenomena is that one feels hungry and sits down to a plate of food, and for some reason the ability the ability to connect the hunger to the act of eating is gone. It vanishes. And you look at the food as some kind of alien object, and if you try mechanically to move it to your lips, it's almost a rising of the gorge. It's just your stomach rebels, and that's what the Rabbanon are referring to. Kol misha boche eino ochel, that someone who is crying, someone who is weeping, but this means really from wrenching from the gut weeping, is deprived of their ability to eat. Shene'emar. It's always interesting. In the world of Chazal, things that have been documented by verses of the Torah or the Tanakh are, in a sense, more real. They are the footnote for human experiences. And so if something is a universal human experience, the chances are that somewhere or another, sooner or later, it will be documented by a biblical reference. And this one is no exception. When it says, Vativkev v'lo sochal, when Chana is so depressed because her co-wife is taunting her because she has no children at the beginning of the first book of Samuel, the Pasuk tells us, and she wept and did not eat. And so this Dimasi Lechem is connected to that source and thought to be the same phenomenon. And then there is a connection which is going to arrive back to our pasuk. The Midrash often does that. It seems suddenly to have lost track of what it was discussing and begin something else. And it strikes us as being a kind of a non sequitur. Sooner or later, the chances are we will circle back and find that the final piece of this new puzzle is indeed the verse which we have been speculating on up to this point. So you always have to cut the Bala Midrash a little slack and allow for the setting of the trap, so to speak, the new context. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of reading Yechezkel, particularly the 12th chapter, which is referenced here, Yechezkel is given a particular kind of prophetic mission. See, sometimes the prophets spoke. Other times the prophets were engaged in symbolic actions or gestures which were intended to raise people's awareness and get the people to say, what the heck are you doing? You crazy? What's the matter with you? Right? And the response to that will be, oh, you better watch out. Something untoward is about to arrive. So in the 12th chapter of Yechezkel, the Almighty comes to him with a mission and says, V'atov ben Adam asei lecha kilei gola. Make for yourself a vessel of exile. In other words, I guess it's sort of the kind of luggage that one would purchase if one was about to be exiled. Probably some kind of a very high-end backpack, which has room for everything you will ever need as you go up a mountain and spend 6 years there, right? So that, of course, it will take you the better part of the 6 years to figure out exactly how to unpack the thing, because they're rather complicated. But we'll leave that for another discussion. But that's the commandment. Make for yourself kilei gola, and then the pasuk will continue. V'galeyomam le'einehem v'galisa mimkomkom mokom acher le'einehem ulai yir'u. Maybe they will notice that you're behaving oddly and ask, what is the message? So the Midrash quotes a discussion exactly what the Navi doesn't tell us. What did his clay gola look like? What did he pack? So Rabbi Chia bar Abba Omar Chemes v'shotiach u'kara, and he packed a leather skin for liquids, v'shatiach, and either a carpet or some kind of a board. The Farshim offer options. Uka'ara is like a curved plate or platter. And each of these things, each of these things was multifunctional, could do two different things. By the way, the Gemara in Nidarim, which has the same tradition in slightly different form, also mentions that he took a lamp. What did they do? Chemes nosein bo kemach. The leather skin could be used to carry flour, v'nosno tachas rosho, and could also put it under his head as a pillow. Ki'ara, and as for the curved bowl, ochel bo b'shoseba, he could both eat from it and he could hold liquid, so he could drink from it. Shatiach, and as for, you might as well call it a carpet, because that's what a carpet would be in modern Hebrew. So nice to see. You're not supposed to make me this happy on Tisha B'Av. That's shame on you, but the seat of honor has been saved for you by your hug. And as for the shatiach li yeshiva, it can be used to sit on. Please, Steve, anywhere is good. Will we put him here for you? And as for the last element, the rug or the platform, the yeshiva v'yashen odam. It's very nice. You can sit on it. You can sleep on it. Rabbi Shimon ben Rabbi Chalafta Omer, Shimon ben Chalafta said, "Kupa shel arba oznayim, v'hi machzekes es hakol." There was some kind of a basket or a box with 4 different handles, and that was able to do all of the above functions. So he didn't need multiple things. This was the equivalent of his Swiss Army knife, right? The Kach Omar Kodesh Baruch Hu Yisrael, and God said to Israel, "V'hayo Yechezkel lochem lemofeis kechol asher osa ta'asu." Yechezkel will be for you a demonstration, an example, because what he is going through, you will go through. In other words, this was a way of announcing that the Jewish people were about to experience exile. And what he was telling them was, prepare yourself for this inevitable fate. But of course, what happens is, Vehem lo asuke. They refused to prepare. Elakivun shegolu. And therefore, when they came to be exiled, and they found themselves, this is a particularly poignant passage to be reading when we think of the people from Syria who have been wandering and trying to find a place for themselves, find themselves living under the most terrible conditions in refugee camps. The images that the Baal Midrash calls up are extremely fresh. I mean, we can imagine this. And he gives this simple example. Imagine a family that is traveling and they've had to leave behind all of their household vessels. We take an awful lot for granted. You know, and part of it is that over living in a single dwelling over years, you collect so much junk, even specialized junk. I am now the proud owner, not of one melon knife, but of 2 melon knives, one of which is particularly for watermelons and one is for cantaloupes. Now, if I were to find myself exiled without my now beloved melon knives, I would be near despair. I would hardly know what to do. I'd have to go back to the old-fashioned way of losing. Oh, we're going to let that go because it's Tisha B'Av. And we're not supposed to hear anything funny. You know it, and in response to not having it, you find me bawling. In any case, Kivun Shigolo, when they found themselves out, people obviously they had to make their own bread. And an individual came, he had to make bread for his family. And he didn't have a vessel, he didn't know what to knead his dough in. The best he could do was to dig a hole in the ground to make an indentation. And he kneaded his bread in this concave hole. And the little stones at the bottom of this, the stones in this ditch, stuck to the dough. The kevon shenosna b'soch piv, and when they would eat the bread, hayushinov kehos olav, his teeth were ground down by the grit, by the pebbles. The kayem mashenemar, and this in fulfillment of the words in the pasuk. And this actually is pasuk in Eicha, where in the 3rd chapter it says, Hisbiani b'merorim hirvani la'ano, God sated me with bitter wormwood and filled me with these weeds. Vayagres bechotzotz shinai, and he ground down with gravel my teeth. Hichpishani ba'efer, and pressed me down and stained me in the ash. So ash and gravel are associated this way with the experience of the hapless refugee. And now we'll come back to the verse with which we began. And my tears were my bread day and night. And here it is actually, by employing this image from Eicha, it is actually bringing to bear a clever play on words. Not dim asim as in dimo, my tears, but in Rabbinic Hebrew, the term demua, meduma, means something which has been mixed with a foreign substance, as for example when something has been tithed and then something that has not been tithed is mixed in with it, so it has a whole problematic status. So it is saying that my bread has been rendered hoiso dim osi lechem yom v'laylo. My bread has been rendered this now impure mixture because of the gravel that's mixed into it. In other words, that normally speaking, when a person is hungry, they look forward to eating. I can't imagine that anyone here is experiencing that just about now, as we are 2 hours and 14 minutes and 16 seconds from the end of the fast. Here, the experience of eating has been suffused with the torment of the exile, and so one looks forward to it. One looks forward to it with pain and with dread. He's going to have to eat. It's all he's got. But now it has been rendered demua. It is no longer certain. There's no confidence. A terrible feeling when you get a piece of eggshell Or when the person serving you spinach salad doesn't know you have to wash spinach, and you have to be polite, and suddenly you're having flashbacks to being in the sandbox when you were 3 and your face was mashed into the sand and your mouth was full of it, and you're wondering, why is that happening? It's because this idiot forgot to take the sand out of the spinach before he made the lovely spinach salad with the raw mushrooms and the strawberries, and helped garnish if it's full of sand. So this apparently is the experience to which we are being referenced. However, that's why this verse is so powerful. And here is when we pull the punchline. We would think that we had just described kind of visceral suffering. He says, "Ve'emas ha'elas lelibi." When does my heart experience pain? Only when we come to the end of the pasuk, "Ve'emor elai kol hayom hayeh Elokecha." When people around me say, "Where is your God?" In other words, the suffering which the exile is enduring is not primarily on the basis of what the personal suffering, the suffering of his own teeth grinding on the gravel and the bread. It's that he is watching himself being watched. And he is seeing people saying, this is the person who lived his life thinking he was close to God. Well, where is your God now? And the Rav actually writes very poignantly about this. I don't know, those of you who have gone through the Lookstein edition of the Kinos, cover to cover, some marvelous material, will basically put me out of business for the next 10 years, but I still recommend it. The Rav mentions riding on the train between New York and Boston during the years of World War II. And he would have people, random people, I guess they saw he was a rabbi, you didn't see that many people with yarmulkes in the 1940s, and beards. He said random people would sit down next to him and say to him, isn't this proof that God has rejected the Jewish people? How can you still believe that God cares about your people when this is happening to them? And so this individual experiences his personal suffering not as a personal catastrophe, but as something which he is desperately afraid is creating a Chilul Hashem in the world. And the greatest Chilul Hashem in the world is the Chilul Hashem that God's love of Israel has perhaps always been a myth, falsification. And so there's this, and this is not unfamiliar theme, that the suffering of the Jew is because he senses the suffering of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. It is for God's suffering that we suffer, even though he is suffering kivayochel for our pain. And so throughout Tisha B'Av, throughout Eicha and Kinos, there is this kind of game of mirrors where we suffer for God and God suffers for us, and we have rebelled against him and he has punished us, and yet those are never primary identities. The identity of sinner and punisher are never the final identity, either of the Ribono Shel Olam or of the Jew in the whole discussion of the suffering around Tisha B'Av. Eventually, each side reverts to feeling sorry for the pain of the other, or for the dishonor of the other, which is essentially what Chilul Hashem is. Now, I'm going to what we call section B on the sheets. Your life is so easy. I had to read through the Mefarshim and realize that there is a section which is between the two, which was not supposed to be printed there, apparently. It's a printer's error, and we'll have to come back to it another year, because we are still under the general heading of Bochosiv Kevalayla. We are extrapolating themes which derive from that verse in the first chapter of the Book of Lamentations, you shall surely weep in the night. Right? So that theme is going to be continued. The first piece of it that you just experienced is sort of a handoff to the verse in Tehillim where it speaks about my tears have replaced my bread. Right? So that's about the weeping, and the weeping that's been replaced by bread, and so we're good with that. This time, the focus of the Baal Midrash is going to be on the doubling, on the fact that it says Bocho Tivkei, the intensive form, you shall surely weep, but as is often the case, we interpret that. Why is the verb doubled? Because somehow there are two different levels of weeping.
Is it continuous or continual? I just don't understand the answer to that.
Well, it depends which of the interpretations. The one where he said that just as bread is tadir is continual. In other words, it's something which recurs in your life again and again. When you speak about my appetite has been replaced by my tears, that's not so much on the question of continual or continuous. That's a whole different approach from tadir. That's the sense of replacement. So when you say that my weeping is as regular as my eating, you're still eating. But it means that just as 3 times a day I eat, whatever it is, so and so many times a day, I find myself weeping. You know, everybody knows the famous line by Senator McCain, said after he lost the election, he slept just like a baby. He woke up every 2 hours and cried. So, same. So I'm so grateful to somebody for not hearing that yet. Thought I was going to have to tell it to my new grandson.
He's heard it.
He's heard it already? 2 days in the hospital and it's over.
That's what he does.
Yeah, he's it.
Yeah.
He doesn't know about McCain yet. Anyway, the pasuk, the Midrash begins, Bocho Sivken, Bocho al Egel Echad, you will weep for one calf, for the golden calf, right? You will weep for one, however, and then Sivke al Shnei Agalim, and you will weep for the 2 calves. Now the 2 calves which he references here are, this is a reference to the story in Malachim Aleph, the wicked king Yerovam ben Nevat. When Yerovam seduced the 10 tribes of the north to separate from the southern tribes when King Solomon died, and his ill-advised son Rechavam decided to redouble the already impossibly heavy burden of taxes. So the 10 tribes of the north broke off and followed the rebel Yerovam ben Nevat. And Yerovam in the 12th chapter of 1 Kings realizes that unless he can provide competition for the national sanctuary in Jerusalem, eventually all the people in his territories are going to make that pilgrimage. When they make that pilgrimage, imagine they would have a good chance of being propagandized by the Rechavam administration, which perhaps at that point was realizing that it had seriously misstepped. And so he understood that, at least in the times of the Tanakh, it was impossible to imagine political viability unless religious institutions went with it. In other words, long before the whole concept of the separation of church and state, Yerovam is just the opposite. Yerovam is saying that the notion of the separation of church and state, which in Our history of ideas was championed by Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, who was really one of the most important political thinkers in American history, because he's a little older than Federalists. He's always given the credit he deserves. But the separation of church and state, which allowed America to become a welcoming place for people of all faiths, really was his revolution. And with this, he broke away from John Winthrop, whose city on the hill, might have been a nice city, but I wouldn't really want to try to make a minion there, because they may have known more Hebrew than most kids graduating for day school, but it helped garnish because they were pretty frum Christians. In any case, Yeroboam realized that he had to establish an alternative, and he did so by setting up calves for worship, and he actually used the same formulation which had been used with the Egel Hazav, and he said, Elu Elohecha Yisrael, these are your gods of Israel who took you up from Egypt. In other words, he claimed to be the logical continuity of Jewish history. He didn't say he was starting a new religion. He merely moved it back in a cultic direction for purely political motives, so that he could control the cult. He clearly couldn't duplicate the Aron HaKodesh that was the centerpiece of the Beis HaMikdash. He couldn't do that, and so what did he do? Kind of in the way when you have to repair a diseased computer, sort of push it back to an earlier date, as it was on so-and-so. So he went back to the Egel Hazav, and he reset the clock to the moment when Israel contemplated its future without the tablets, which Moshe Rabbeinu would eventually bring down. So far, nobody brought them anything, not even a T-shirt, nothing. And they were waiting at the bottom of the mountain, and the Egel Hazav was the result. In other words, the capacity to continue the belief in the Exodus, but with familiar, accessible, homemade symbols, which was the Egel Hazav. So Yeroboam picks up the stitch exactly from there. Right? He is without everything that Moshe brought down, namely the luchos, which became the center of the Mishkan. He's completely outside of that center of, excuse the expression, I'm using it in a technical way, of the cult, and takes the cult back to a slightly earlier form and begins it again, feeling that by so doing, the 10 tribes, they can live with that, because it was part of their history. Nevertheless, we now have in our history not one, but 3 calves of gold. The original, and then we have Beit El and Dan. And that is why the number 3 here is actually the requisite number, according to the Farshim, not only Bachot Tivkeh Balayla, but also Dim Asa Alechya. She shall surely cry at night, and her tears will be on her cheek. So you have cry, cry, and tears. One for each of the 3 veerings away, represented by the calves of gold. Interesting is that this is all based on the notion which Chazal preserved, that there is never a point at which the Jewish people suffer which does not include some continuing recompense for the sin of the golden calf. And in the light of this midrash, that suddenly makes great sense, because we understand that the sin of the golden calf, like they say, you can't really delete anything from a computer. You can just write over it. Well, the golden calf remains in the consciousness of Am Yisrael like a nasty deleted email. And that is why Yeroboam is able to bring it back to life. But he brings it back to life and doubles down. So we now have 2. So the notion is that when we experience suffering, it is not just that, I think I want to spank you again for that cookie you stole in the 4th grade. This is not some kind of vindictiveness that God won't let it go. It is rather a kind of an ongoing preventative measure, as if you can imagine some kind of a toxin in the body for which one has to take an anti-venom or what do they call that? A vaccine on a regular basis, because unless it's vaccinated again and again and again, it will regrow. It will return. The haraya, it did. And so this notion that all of the sufferings of Jewish people contain an element of response to the Egel Hazav, that means that not only do the sufferings contain that element, but we have to look carefully and determine whether the sins that triggered that suffering contain that element of the Egel Hazav. What is the Egel Hazav? And here I can't, I'm not speaking as a scholar or as a teacher citing the source, more as a darshan. The Egel Hazav is the God we can manipulate to reflect us. The great labor of Jewish spiritual history is the labor of imitatio Dei, that we are to imitate Him, to make ourselves God-like. And it is so easy to slip into the easy pattern where we use God as our excuse for our own little depravities. And so we refashion Him in our image. That is the Egel Hazav. That we use this soft, bright, attractive material and we mold it until we can say, Elo Elohecha Yisrael. This is the God of the Jews. But sometimes it just isn't. Midrash continues, Davar Acher Bocho Al Golus Aseres Hashvatim Sivkeh Al Golus Shevet Yehuda Binyamin. Here again we go back to the 2 form, I think, Bocho Sivkeh. Weep for the loss, for the exile of the 10 tribes, and weep again for the final destruction of the remaining 2 tribes, of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. This is important because we never let go of the 10 tribes. 10 tribes who were vanquished by the Assyrians long before the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed were in a sense not ancestors who is that easier? Not ancestors with whom we cuddle. What do I mean by that? There are certain ancestors where we have a sense of connection to them. I mean, I've always told you, when I think of my great-grandfather, my great-grandfather would walk into the room, I would fall into his arms with no sense of strangeness or distance. It would be very natural, because I've lived with him, and he is much of what I have been taught to aspire to. On the other hand, if you were suddenly introduced to an ancestor, I don't know, some kind of a Cro-Magnon, I'm not implying that you have Cro-Magnon ancestors and I have a famous chazan. I meant if we go back far enough so that the people we're encountering don't seem like us at all. They seem very strange. Well, that gives you some notion of the 10 tribes. The 10 tribes are not, as the old people used to say about shoes, they're not bichfem. They're not like comfortable ancestors. They're odd ancestors, and you know they weren't that devout. Frankly, they were pretty messed up.
And so we could sort of write off the 10 tribes and say, all right, they're gone. We're sorry about the Beis HaMikdash, we miss the Kohen Gadol, we miss, like the Bechem ancestors. And when he says, B'chot tivkeh, when the Midrash tells us this, it says, it doesn't work like that. That is not the way Jewish family works. We don't have acceptable losses of those who have ceased to resemble us to the point of comfort. We don't write them off. The first weeping, B'chol, is for the 10 tribes. And this lesson has its important applications in family, in community. We don't just write off the uncomfortable ones. The Bala Midrash continues, Dovar acher b'cho umevako acherim imo. This is a fascinating reading. B'cho tivkeh does not just mean doubling 2 different cryings, 2 different weepings, but it says one refers to weeping and the other is causing others to weep with her. The awareness, now here we move into a completely different mindset. And this is what I've referred to in various points as what I would call the universalization of Churban. And that means the recognition that when these titanic catastrophes befall the Jewish people, they resonate, they reverberate far, far beyond. This is not a parochial catastrophe. And you'll see this manifested in several forms. That we weep and we feel that God is also weeping, that God shares the suffering of the Jewish people. The pasuk from Yeshayahu, Vayikra Hashem tzvakos bayom hahu livchi ulemispeid, and the Lord God called on, the Lord of hosts called on that day for weeping and for lament, meaning that to join him in those things. Weeping and recognizing that the ministering angels of heaven are also crying. The angels cried outward. And in order to understand this strange word chutza, Rabbi Zera employs, we bring in Rabbi Zera who interprets it in another area. We're talking about it as the angels weeping over the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Zera remembers another famous instance of angelic tears, and that is when the angels wept over the supine form of Isaac on the altar at the Akedah. Right? We're told when the Midrash wants to explain why the Torah later says, and Isaac's eyes were dimmed, one of the Midrashic interpretations is that as he was on the altar, I've mentioned this many times, famous Rashi, as he was on the altar, the angels were so moved by Abraham's faithful sacrifice that the angels began to weep, and the tears fell in his eyes. And the angel's tears dimmed his eyes, affected his vision. And Rabbi Zera actually supports this reading with the verse that we just quoted from the book of Isaiah. And he understands it is his chitza hi gabei denachsinei. He says it is to them, the angels saw in this an act which was literally outrageous, something which was beyond the pale. In other words, whether it was because they were moved by Abraham's faith or whether they realized what the conclusion would be and that child sacrifice was a hideous way to serve God, nevertheless, they declared this to be out of all bounds. Right? And so here also the chitza of the Erelim, Tzaku Chutza, is is in the same, we take Rabbi Zera's interpretation, we move it here, and that is their response to the Churban. That the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, you have to remember that the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was an assault on world order. It was like somebody removed Belgium. Even worse, because it was, I mean, like Netherlands and Spain started to collapse, You couldn't imagine a world without this element. It was as if look what happened in Manhattan this week. Right? The steam pipe bursting. Right? This one pipe is only 20 inches. 20 inches is a lot. Not so big. 20 inches is like this. A whole neighborhood in Manhattan is shut down. People were running to get themselves showered from the asbestos, right? That's just one steam pipe in one little city. Imagine the conduit that connects heaven and earth, which is what the Beis HaMikdash is. Imagine when that pipe is shattered, the implications for the universe. When its parts become disjointed, it's like you almost sense that we could just float out into the galaxy and burn up. Omar Raperachia understands it a little different. Kemo de'at Omar vayotze osa hachutza. That it is similar to the verse where Hashem takes Abraham outside to show him the stars. And there it says hachutza means out of just earth, but into a perception of heaven and earth. And so that's where Rabbi Brachia gets the idea, is that the angels grieve for the loss of the Beis HaMikdash, because that's what chutzah means. Then he goes on, Bocho umavako shamayim va'aretz imor. She weeps, and the heavens and the earth weep with her. Hodahu dichsiv, and here she quotes the verse from the prophet Joel, Shemesh v'yoreach kodoru. The sun and the moon were suddenly darkened. And this is their response to the Churban. Bocho mavako, crying and causing others. This time mavako harimu gvo'os imo. The topography of the world, the mountains and the hills. Now remember, it is the mountains and the hills that leapt like lambs when God redeemed the Jewish people from Egypt. That's the sort of one of the core images of Hallel, because exactly that same principle, the idea that what goes on between God and the Jewish people has implications for all of reality. And that's why when we say Malacha Hayom Kisanus, the puzzled Israelites just leaving Egypt, they're looking at the sea and seeing that the sea is in a state of unnatural agitation. There's like nature has gone crazy around them. Malacha Yom Kisanus Hayarden Yisov Le'achar. The later, when the Jordan would split, what's going on? And Harim Tirkedu Cha'elim Givos Kivenetzon. The nature knows. Nature understands what's happening to us. We're the only blockheads who are in the middle of this sublime pageant and are walking like, does anyone have some soda? It's like they just don't get it. And so the same happens at the time of the Churban. The Churban, these same hills and mountains that leapt for joy when God and Israel were joined, they tremble and weep when it seems that God and Israel have at least for a moment been sundered. And that is how we explain the verse in Jeremiah where it says, Ra'isi es harim v'hinei roashim. I saw the mountains and they were trembling. V'chol ha'gavaos v'hiskalkalu, and the hills and they were undone. Bocho boche umavako shivim umos imo. This is not something only in the galaxy. It's not only in of the earth, the planet Earth with its hills. It is also the other 70 nations of the world. Amar Rabbi Pinchas osam shivim porim shal Yisrael makrivim bechag keneged shivim umosheim k'doi shelo yitzodeh ha'olam mehem. The 70 bullocks of Sukkot are actually offerings on behalf of the 70 nations of the world, so that they shouldn't be destroyed or emptied out, right? And so they are weeping, and they are weeping because the loss of the Beis Hamikdash means that their the advocacy which is part of the mission of the Jews, has been paralyzed with the loss of the Beis Hamikdash. And so if they realized it, there are a few things. The nations of the world, if they would realize how much the Beis Hamikdash would do for them, they would post an army around Jerusalem to make sure that the temple was functioning. There's a few other things that they could recognize. You know what the Rav Hutner says? That if the nations of the world realized how much pleasure Jews have from not saying Tachnun, they would all convert immediately, just so they could be there too to skip Tachnun. He further goes on and he says, it is the house of Israel which weeps together with Tzion Dirsi Vatisa Kol Ha'eda. All of the people lifted their voices in weeping. Rabbi Chunya Masni Labashim Rabbi Nehemia Vatisa Kesiv Chove Bisha Os Pisun the Doraya. That with that disappointment when they wept for nothing, which is actually was mentioned earlier, the Bechia, when Hashem earned us Bechia L'Doros, when the Jews wept when the spies returned, she says, with that, beautiful phrase, Chovi Bisha Us Pisum L'Darayo, they acquired an onerous debt for all generations. In other words, what he's saying is, just as some of the weeping derives from the sin of the golden calf, some of the weeping also derives from the failure of faith that surrounded the mission of the spies into the land of Israel. The mission of faith, which, as we mentioned here on Shabbos morning, those of you who were here, degraded the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu for 38 years. Rashi mentions it in this week's parsha. Extended the period of the wandering in the wilderness, and also cost them the privilege of having Moshe Rabbeinu be the one to establish the people on the land, and to establish the people in the sanctuary, which of course would have rendered those institutions truly eternal from that point forward, and the whole cycle would have been spared. And so the ignition point, the weeping of the people in response to the spies, he actually makes a very clever play on words. Batisol, they lifted their voices, but there's another similar verb, nosheh, to take a loan, to be burdened with a loan. They acquired for themselves this eternal indebtedness and heartbreak. I think we'll stop there, folks, and thank you so much. And we should have a chance to gather. I left